Welcome, welcome. I see people coming in. Welcome, and we'll give you a second to get settled. Welcome to everybody. I see our number of participants has not gone up for a second, so we can go ahead and get started. And if anyone trickles in, that's totally fine. I can see you. Okay, great. So good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's morning where I am. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Maddie Duke, and on behalf of ABA Technologies, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy days to come and join us. At ABA Technologies, we specialize in providing comprehensive training and performance management solutions designed for ABA organizations like yours. As behavior analysts, we understand your unique challenges in delivering high quality behavioral services while managing training requirements, clinical oversight, and operational efficiency. Today's webinar is going to focus on the upcoming changes to the RBT certification, and our fantastic speakers will share what you need to know to prepare. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Danielle LaFrance, who serves as a clinical consultant with over 2 decades of experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities. Danielle brings more than 13 years of experience in director level positions for ABA companies. She has an impressive background in leading clinical teams and creating professional development systems, including establishing the first 2 ABA internship sites in Sacramento, California. And Danielle has mentored over 40 student interns through to BCBA certification. Her professional interests include verbal behavior, generative programming, evidence-based practices, and staff development. I'm also delighted to introduce Adam Hockman, our Senior Vice President of Learning Partnerships and Growth. As one of our instructional designers, Adam focuses on integrating innovative educational technologies and instructional design methods into our expanding range of products. Adam plays a pivotal role in building learning and performance systems, as well as corporate training programs that enhance professional capabilities. His background includes valuable work developing educational technologies in private school settings and for pediatric cancer patients. Without any further delay, I'll hand it over to Danielle to begin our presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maddie. Thank you so much for being here today. Everyone who is here. I don't know who's here. I can't see your cameras. I can't see your names. But thank you for joining us as we talk about some of the changes to RBT certification that are coming up. As Maddie said, I am a 25-year clinician. I have worked in a variety of settings with a variety of populations. And one of the things that's been a passion of mine is training staff. So I feel all of you clinicians that are attending today and some of the pain points around having to shift your training systems. But what we will try to do for you today is summarize some of the changes that are coming. And I just want to preface this presentation by saying that none of what we say today is anything that we at ABA Technologies have invented. It's all coming directly from the BACB. So let me see if I can get my slides to move forward here. Perfect. All right, so like I said, all of the information we're going to talk about today is outlined in the BACB's December newsletter, December 2023 newsletter. So if you want to reference that, it is linked here in the presentation for you. But before we get into what's changing, let's talk about why things are changing a little bit. And really, certification programs, more generally speaking, have to remain current with changes in professional practice and certification requirements. RBT certification requirements within behavior analysis were last reviewed in 2017. So it's been quite some time since there was a review and changes that were put forward by the BACB. Now, due to some significant changes in the profession of applied behavior analysis over the intervening years, so between 2017 and now, there have been changes to eligibility, examination, and maintenance requirements. And those changes were reviewed by a group of SMEs in both 2022 and 2023. And that work led to some pretty big changes. So, what exactly is changing? We're going to try to summarize this for you today. Again, you've got the link to the BACB newsletter there, but hopefully we can do this in a succinct way for you. So the first big change, and really the topic of today's presentation, is related to those RBT training requirements. Up until now, RBTs were required to complete 40 hours of training in any format, so long as the second edition task list items were covered in that training. And the time distribution and delivery format were not specified. With these new requirements, what we're seeing is that RBTs still have to complete that 40-hour training, but the BACB is now requiring that delivery of the training includes BST or behavioral skills training, plus any combination of the additional strategies listed. So you've got video-based instruction, you've got in vivo modeling. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see them up on the slide there. But the key piece is that there is now some guideline around that format, and you have to deliver BST plus one of or a combination of these other training strategies. The other thing to be noted here is that assigned readings do not count towards those 40 hours of training. So while assigning literature or readings on specific topics to your RBTs in training are probably a really good idea in terms of expanding their knowledge set related to a certain topic, that time cannot be counted towards the 40 hours. Additionally, the content and number of hours is dictated across sections of the third edition task list. So this is a pretty big change from the second edition. And this chart was taken, it's not the exact same chart from the newsletter, but you'll see some similarities here. It summarizes what's in the BACB's newsletter regarding the RBT 2026 40-hour training requirements and curriculum outline. And that curriculum outline is linked on the slide at the top of the table there if you want to look at it and delve into it in more detail. But you can see across the content areas A through H, there's a specific duration for each of those content areas in training. And you might also notice the total comes to 38 hours. That's because there's 2 unallocated or discretionary hours that can be added to any section of the 40-hour requirement, which provides trainers the flexibility to spend more time on certain areas depending on what the specific individual RBT needs to focus on. So that's kind of cool because you can customize or tailor it a little bit depending on your individual learner. All the content of the curriculum outline corresponds to the new examination requirements, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But I think Adam wanted to say something about this slide, so I will just be quiet for a minute and let him speak.
Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah.
The reason I wanted to talk on this slide is because in the past, if you've been around long enough to make changes through other task lists, this one is more difficult to make changes with because previously task items may have changed, things may have been moved around to different categories, they may have been renamed, the verb for the quote unquote learning objective may have changed, but here you're going to be moving content around and the hours are going to matter, the seat time is going to matter. So that's really important for organizations that are using hybrid programs where you're not having someone sit through a full 40-hour e-learning, but you're combining time from an e-learning and some instructor-led training, some of those other training methodologies you saw on the previous slide. So you have to be cautious about this because it's very possible that you may be counting things currently that are not going to count toward the 40 hours. For example, a big mistake that organizations make is that they count when it comes to data collection and measurement. I've seen many times where instructor-led training sessions, which involve setting up Catalyst or setting up Central Reach, whatever platform, are getting counted toward the data collection hours. And you can't do that. That's got to be separate time. So if you're spending the first 30 minutes of a data collection training focused on getting them into the platform, those are 30 minutes you need to spend, but they're not 30 minutes that count toward the 3-hour bucket. So you have to really go in, and in a little bit when we talk about implications, we're going to talk about doing some initial internal audits to look at where you stand in terms of your content hours. And it's also a service that we work with people on as we tailor and customize these programs to their settings.
Thank you for providing more of that insight, Adam. I think that's incredibly important and also incredibly helpful to highlight. All right, so the next big change, right? We know that there's big changes coming for RBTs that impact them directly, but there are broader impacts within an organization when we're talking about having to make these changes for RBTs. So this next change is related to trainer qualifications. Up until now, responsible trainers and responsible assessors needed to be certified. They did not need to complete an 8-hour supervisor training, and they could delegate a portion or a majority of tasks to a proficient assistant, but there was no certification requirement for assistants. That's changing with the new requirements. So with the new requirements, what we're seeing is that assistant trainers and assistant assessors also need to be certified at least at the RBT level, if not higher. In addition, responsible trainers have to complete the 8-hour supervisor training. And I think this stands to reason because if you're taking on training tasks, you should probably be trained to supervise. I also mentioned previously that new training requirements correspond to the new examination requirements. So we'll take a closer look at this third big change now. As described in the BACB's December 2023 newsletter, the job task analysis, or what can be abbreviated as a JTA, is the primary method for the BACB to develop high-stakes examinations, actually across certification programs. It's just the primary way that examinations are developed for professions. And the BCB has used this process in development of all of their examinations. And what that process includes is developing a draft test content outline, or TCO, vetting that draft using a content validation survey typically sent to professionals within the profession, and then finalizing an examination blueprint upon which the new examination is then developed and built. So on this slide, you can see all the steps that were taken in developing these new examination requirements. So the JTA began in February of 2022 with a committee of 12 SMEs that reviewed that content, looking specifically at the second edition RBT task list. Then, as I mentioned, they looked at content validation. That resulted in a new test content outline. And then in August of 2022, a committee of 10 subject matter experts, or SMEs, looked at the distribution of content across each of the domains in the task list, as well as a number of questions for each task. And that all of that work together generated the final examination blueprint, which was approved by the BACB in August of 2023. So it's a pretty long, involved process with a lot of input from a lot of SMEs. And here's a crosswalk that, again, there's an example of this in a table in the December 2023 newsletter, comparing RBT 2.0 task list to RBT 3.0 task list, or second edition to third edition. And we've got it summarized here as well across all of the content areas. Just some things to highlight. Again, you can look at this, you can find it in the newsletter, but just some things that I wanted to highlight to you. The total number of questions on the examination remains the same across the second and third edition. So when RBTs go to take their examination, their certification examinations, it will be the exact same number of questions that they have to go through. We also have the same 6 content domains as on the second edition task list, but there's some minor title revisions to 4 of those domains. So some of these things probably feel very similar, and that's great, right? We love familiarity. But there are some important changes. So total number of tasks has been increased by 6 in the third edition. And domain F, this is one of the bigger changes, now contains 10 specific tasks instead of just a general reference to the entire RBT ethics code. So this is much more focused and honed in on ethics specifically. A fourth big change in requirements consists of the elimination of the non-certified RBT supervisor role. So let me just explain that a little bit more. Up until now, RBT supervisors could hold a BCABA, BCBA, or BCBA D certification, or be licensed in another behavioral health profession as long as they completed the 8-hour supervisor training. With these new requirements, only a BCABA, BCBA, or BCBA-D who has also completed the 8-hour supervisor training can serve as an RBT supervisor. So what we're seeing is the complete elimination of the possibility for someone who's trained differently to act as an RBT supervisor. It's a pretty big change. And another big change pertains to the duration of the RBT certification cycle. So previously, RBTs are required to complete a renewal competency assessment and recertify annually. So they just had to get that assessment completed. They would submit that, pay their fee, renew their certification. With these new requirements, the renewal competency has been eliminated, and instead it's being replaced with ongoing professional development requirements. Additionally, RBTs will be required to recertify on a bi-yearly or every other year basis. So this is going to line up with our certification cycles as BCBAs and BCBA-Ds. And I'm just going to quote something out of the December 2023 newsletter here, just to give you a little bit more context around this. During the review, the Requirements Committee considered the original purpose of the maintenance requirements, which is to ensure that RBTs remain proficient in performing critical skills. The ongoing supervision requirement serves this purpose, including monthly observations of the RBT skills during service delivery to ensure that they are successfully performing critical skills on a regular basis. However, the Requirements Committee indicated that, now more than ever, RBTs must improve upon and learn new skills rather than demonstrate maintenance of entry-level skills. So I think it's important here to emphasize that the professional development provided to RBTs during each certification cycle probably should really focus on furthering those RBT skills beyond just those basic application or implementation skills. This is really what seems to be getting sought out with this change in this requirement. So we're looking at really refining RBT repertoires, furthering them as professionals versus maintaining a focus on just those basic ins and outs and mechanics of session implementation. And this leads to our sixth big change, professional development requirements. So up until now, this was not required of RBTs. We know as BCBAs, BCBADs, we've had to get our CEUs every certification cycle. We have to submit them. With the new requirements, RBTs will now be required to complete 12 units of continuing education or professional development per 2-year certification cycle. And according to the BCB's December 2023 newsletter, considering this new focus on ongoing learning, the Requirements Committee also recommended moving to a 2-year recertification cycle to make it consistent with the BCBA and BCABA recertification cycles. And then, like I said, they're recommending that the RBTs complete 12 hours of professional development during that 2-year cycle. And professional development can be in one or more of the areas shown in the table on this slide. So you may have in organization and service trainings related to behavior analytics service delivery. That can count. There's provider specifications here as well as some documentation. We're still waiting for more information from the BACB to be released publicly on some of these documentation requirements. So that's still to come. I can't speculate on what that's going to look like, but they will be providing additional guidance. Another category where they can get some of this ongoing professional development is going to be continuing education events that has to be provided by an ACE provider, and then attending university courses in behavior analysis and passing with a grade of C or higher, unless there's a pass or fail system, in which case they'd have to pass that course. And that would have to be obtained at an accredited university. So some pretty big changes here as well, but nothing that's unfamiliar to folks that have a master's degree or a PhD in behavior analysis, because we have to do this on a 2-year cycle as well. We'll just have to assist our RBTs in seeking this out and getting these CUs. All right, so to quickly summarize, give you some bullet points around these changes. New training requirements require that we use a dedicated curriculum outline. New trainer qualifications will require that responsible trainers complete the 8-hour supervisor training, and that assistant trainers and assessors hold at least an RBT certification, if not higher. The new examination is based on the test content, the new test content outline that resulted from that JTA and SME review process. New supervisor qualifications stipulate that BCABA, BCBA, BCBAD can only supervise and must complete the 8-hour supervisor training. There's a new recertification cycle. It's moving from annual to biannual, and 12 ongoing professional development credit units are required in that 2-year cycle. And there's the elimination of the renewal competency assessment in favor of that ongoing professional development for RBTs. That's a lot of big changes. And you might ask, if you're not aware, when are these all going into effect? The timeline is January 1, 2026. So this means that even if an RBT applicant is trained prior to this time, if they haven't certified prior to this time, or if they have applied but they haven't taken the exam and certified prior to this time, testing will occur with the current edition of the RBT task list. So that means 3.0, testing will occur based on 3.0 starting January 1, 2026. And anyone sitting for that exam must have met all of these requirements. So at this point, I'm going to kick it off to Adam, and he's going to talk more about some of the implications of this at the organizational level, as well as some of the things that we do to partner with companies to really help make sure that all these requirements are being met.
Great. Thanks so much, Danielle. And again, we're providing a lot of information here, but it is everyone's responsibility, especially if you're a training director, if you're a clinical director supervising individuals, or you're ensuring that they're meeting the training requirements. You need to go and read the newsletter, the test content outline, the handbook that goes for training. You need to be sure that you are aware of all of these changes, because there are many details inside of those handbooks. And we see that with larger organizations, they're handing off a lot of things related to RBT training to HR specialists and coordinators who don't know the answers. And so there are a lot of things that can come up, like somebody starts their training, they leave the organization, they come back in 3 months. Do those training hours that they completed prior to leaving, do those count toward the 40 hours? What happens if they come to from another organization, they've completed the 40 hours and they haven't completed the competency assessment? How do you verify the program that they went through? So those are things that often HR folks need to go and ask a BCBA, but it's really important that you know what the answers are to those questions. The other thing is that there's been, I think, a trend in, as more online training providers have been available to organizations, some people who are signing their names on certificates as responsible trainer forget they are the responsible trainer. That all of those individuals that receive certificates under their certification number, you're liable for them. So you need to know, and your organization needs to provide you with an audit log so that you know that 1,500 technicians have completed the 40 hours under your certification, okay? Don't be negligent in just leaving that up to chance and waiting until the BACB audits you or another regulatory body. You need to stay on top of it. And if you are the responsible trainer, you should request those logs on an ongoing basis so you know who's out there and whose certificates are under your certification number. So let's talk about some of the implications related to this. As Danielle just mentioned, January 1's where all of that goes into effect. So this summer is the time when you really need to figure out how all of this is going to work. If you were to give, a lot of organizations don't use the full 180 days to allow people to complete the training. Sometimes they do it in a month or they do it in 2 months, and then it's followed by that 90-day period where they can complete the competency assessment. But you need to be ready so that when you're preparing people at the end of the year, especially around October, November, December, where we've got more holidays in November and December, that you've planned out when you're going to make that transition. And that may mean that some of your later cohorts in the year need to go through a newer version of the training if you're on an old version. And so you have to pay per seat with the training provider. Or you might have to create a phasing plan where you have some participants go through your core training you've already got implemented, and the rest of them are going to go through your new training. Hopefully you don't have to do that. You can make one big shift and everybody moves with the whole system, because The 2.0 requirements are captured in the 3.0 requirements. The 3.0 are more stringent and more specified. But if you were in that situation, you would want to be thinking about that because there's going to be a cost associated with it as well. The things that you really need to talk about now are in that yesterday box. Preparing for this, who's going to be providing this training, who are going to be the responsible trainers and the assessors, making sure that if I go back to what I said earlier about HR or other types of coordinators, sometimes we see office managers doing some of the coordination and supervision of these certificates, that you all come together, have a committee that's really focused on meeting the requirements. You know exactly where your audit logs are so that you know if you're using a hybrid plan, you've got some online learning, you've got some in-person training, you've got some in vivo role play and practice. You can track across the board where you are and where those requirements are being tracked. The worst time to do all of that is when you're being audited. The worst time to prepare for an audit is during an audit. So you want to make sure you do that well ahead of time. We have some great friends over at ABA Compliance Solutions. I think Rose is here today. Rose Fedek and Michael Fabrizio, they help small, medium, and large size organizations with a variety of things in the realm of compliance, not just training, but auditing, information privacy and security, billing and coding, risk assessments and management. And they've provided, if you scan that QR code, and we'll send this out afterwards, they've provided two really great resources to kind of begin to do a self-assessment on, are we ready to bring on the 3.0 changes? They've also got a form in there that you can use for tracking those requirements. So that's a helpful form to compare against how are we tracking them maybe in our learning management system or our HRIS, and how are we going to be tracking them to make sure that if we get audited by the BACB or another regulatory body, we can prove that people have completed this material. So they've highlighted for us in some of these slides some really important considerations when it comes to ensuring that your training is compliant with the standards. And this is the first one, maintaining a comprehensive training record. Now, this for some of you who are sending people through a full 40-hour online training, this sounds like a no-brainer. Of course, you can just pull whatever the record is, the grade book, an Excel spreadsheet of participants, the modules they've completed, the total number of hours, or a certificate. But in other organizations where you're using a hybrid approach, where you might have people go through, let's say, 10, 12 hours of asynchronous online training, in addition to some in-person training with a trainer, and you're going to count some in vivo hours. You need to make sure that the record of all of that shows that they have completed each of the components that are part of it. So if you're going to be doing 10 hours online, that you can easily pull the record that shows they've completed those 10 hours. If they are completing 5 hours in person, that you've got a sign in and a sign out log to show that they were there for the entire duration of the training. This is something, as organizations design training programs, this is the piece that can get really sloppy really quickly. Because a BCBA, a clinical director, a clinical development department, they'll design an RBT training, or they'll design pieces of an RBT training, and then they'll send it out to the local clinics where maybe an advanced technician delivers it, maybe a BCBA delivers it, and they're not keeping good records. They may keep yes, this person was here, but they may not keep that person actually left 15 minutes early. They may also, as I mentioned earlier, they may have a combined data collection and measurement training where part of it was meant to set up Catalyst or set up Central Reach. And they usually anticipated to take 30 minutes, but it took 45 because the cohort was really big. So you don't start the data collection and measurement counting until those 45 minutes are over. So you have to be very careful about the way that you're tracking this. And again, the worst time to collect all this documentation is when you're being audited, or when you've got someone that's left the organization, they've come back and you're looking for their training record. And this can become actually quite complex because you might be using different systems. You might be using, for example, we've got our clients who use us for the RBT online. They do some in-person training. They use a different system for things like bloodborne pathogen training, annual training, any other compliance topics. And so then they're tracking all of these different requirements, and they're not all really in one central location. And so then they have some conflicting information, or it's very difficult to kind of piece all of this together. So the comprehensive record should show that entire learner journey from the beginning of training all the way to the end. And then, of course, retaining the records for a minimum of 7 years. The second one is implementing an internal audit process. And for this one, this is a great area where Rose and Michael specialize in if you ever need help with this. But making sure that you regularly review training materials. Just because you scripted and put together slides for a training session does not mean the person that's implementing it is implementing it with fidelity. And I've seen way too many trainings where we'll receive their training materials like a PowerPoint that's been put together. And we say, oh, great, you're covering all the topics. They give us the estimated seat time. You go in, and at this one location in North Carolina, the one trainer has decided that certain topics aren't really relevant to that client population. So they start cutting material, or they start rushing through it, or they take a role play and they say, you know what, we don't need to do the whole role play. We're going to shrink it from 30 minutes down to 10 minutes. Okay. Now, before that was sort of okay because you kind of all came out in the wash. You know, you kind of got all the 40 hours somehow. Okay. Some people getting there better than others, but you usually got the 40 hours. Now, in this case, if you start trimming and people don't know that other people are trimming, you're going to have certain sites that are not actually getting the full 40 hours. They're not getting those 20 hours of behavior change interventions, okay? So you got to be really careful about that. So that's going to mean you need to go in there and actually monitor people delivering the training. And you're also going to need to have some change messaging around this. You need trainers, technicians, people who don't necessarily agree with the content that you're teaching, but are delivering the content, know why the content's in there. They know why it's important that they deliver it with fidelity. And they know that if they remove any of the content, it needs to be indicated to the people who are tracking the requirements for the trainees. So you need to regularly review the materials because materials will drift over time, especially multi-site organizations where you've got someone creating training and then you're sending it down to other people to deliver. Training can change over time. You want to use checklists to verify that all the curricular components are there and adequately covered. So that means not only are you reviewing the materials, but that when you go in and do your own internal audit of this, this March 1st cohort that started at the North Carolina location, that I've gone in and I've made sure that they have completed the online component, that there wasn't one extra module that someone forgot, okay? The reason this gets tricky is because when you start combining components, sometimes you're manually issuing certificates. And so there's times where you might have an LMS that's delivering some of the content. And so they've gotten through 9 of the 10 components and the person doesn't go back in and check the 10th component. Okay, the trainer went in, they checked the 9th component because that was a prerequisite to the instructor-led training. So you got to be really careful there in the way you can track that. And that's something that we're working with organizations on. If they are using a learning management system, how they can begin adding in those ILT and those in vivo hours into the full training record. Next one, ensure the trainer and the assessor qualifications are met. You want to confirm that that responsible trainer has completed the 8-hour supervision. And you want to occasionally remind them that they are the responsible trainer, especially if you're a large organization. More than once, we've come into a project where someone will ask, who's your responsible trainer? People go, oh, is it me? Is it still you on the certificate? I can't remember if we switched that, okay? That's like a big uh-oh, because the uh-oh is that person gets audited and then all of those people have received certificates under your certification. So don't let that happen. The other thing that needs to be part of your ongoing compliance program related to RBT training is that you're on an ongoing basis, you're verifying assistant trainers who are holding an RBT certification. Because if you have an RBT certification, there's certain supervision requirements in place. So you need to make sure that the BCBA supervising that RBT has an active certification. So you have to be continuing to monitor this. So getting on to a regular cadence where you're checking it every quarter or every 2 months or what have you, that you've got a way to look at all of these compliance components. And again, that QR code goes to some of those worksheets that can help you in tracking some of that. The next one is to prepare for a potential audit. Again, the worst time to prepare for an audit is when an audit is happening. So be ready. Make sure that you've got all those pieces pulled together, especially if you've got different people tracking different requirements, okay? Another common thing I've seen is where people get the office manager prints out an attendance log for an in-person training, and the trainer takes paper pencil attendance, and then they don't give that form back to the OM to upload to whatever system they're tracking in. And so then you come to a let's say at that site, that person or someone else at that site is delivering the certificate. The trainer remembers that individual was in all of the trainings. There's a record of what they completed online, but there is no paper record of them completing the in-person trainings. And so then when they get audited, they have this gap. They look into their records and they put it all together and they say, oh my gosh, where did that cohort's in-person verifications go? And nobody can find them. So you've got to have a system that is timely of people uploading that and knowing that if there are inconsistencies across those records, if there are inconsistencies in what you pull from the LMS and what you pull from the trainer logs for in-person training, what you pull from the in vivo logs, then you might be in a situation where you're not compliant with a variety of standards. So those are some of the compliance considerations related to this. Again, I think one of the biggest changes with the seat time requirements by content area is going to put a lot of pressure on some organizations that are trying to pull this together. What some organizations sometimes do when there's a seat time requirement is they say, let's go ahead and have people go through the full 40 hours online, even though we need to do an additional like 12 to 15 hours of some clinical content that's delivered by a trainer, and we're going to do safety care or some other crisis management program, and they're going to go through some HR training, and they're going to do in vivo training, and we're going to have overlaps. And then people are looking at their end of months and saying, oh my gosh, why is it taking people 75 to 90 hours to go through training? Okay, well, that's because there wasn't really careful planning about how all of those different touch points could potentially count toward the total 40 hours. So there are ways we work with a lot of organizations on developing tailored programs. We've got a base 40-hour course that people go through all the time, but a lot of organizations, they want to streamline that. They want to have have participants go through our concepts and principles material, our intro to ABA, our intro to the RBT or autism, and then they want them to go through their in-person data collection training, which makes good sense because if your data collection methods are very specific to your organization, the way that they're set up, or any other procedure for that matter, then it's really important that they get training on your methodologies, and those could contribute toward the 40 hours. So we work with organizations on tailoring the online 40 hours so that you're not creating this very disruptive experience. This is very common in RBT training, which is that a new hire comes into an organization and you've created this really disparate training experience. There's no cohesive journey. You could not follow the thread if there was one, okay? You start at the beginning and the things that happen are, today you're gonna go through 4 hours of online modules. Tomorrow you're gonna do 5 more of those and you're gonna meet with HR. The next day you're gonna go in and start doing some clinical observations. Oh, by the way, I know you just kind of went through the measurement stuff yesterday. Let's have you go ahead and try to take IOA. And then the next day, okay, now we're going to have you go through our in-person data collection training. We wonder why people walk out the second day of training. I mean, it's no question, okay? It's completely chaotic. So tailoring the approach so that there is a cohesive journey, so that it follows what the person's going to do when they are actually assigned a client, is not only a way to build competence and confidence, but it's also a way to get them invested in what they're doing, which is really good work if they can make it to the front line and do the work. So we help people kind of figure out where those touch points are, create a cohesive story throughout their training, add in the components that you need. We know you need some random compliance trainings here, and you need to add in the safety care, and you need to add in this component, but do it in a way that feels holistic. It feels like a journey, and then know exactly where do you need to do your trainer check-ins, where do you need to do your supervision check-ins. So we do that on a tailored program, on a tailored projects, but also customized projects where we help people design interactive and in-person simulation-based data collection training or skill acquisition training and so forth. As Danielle mentioned, there's the new professional development requirement. And there's a lot to this one. We just recently launched ProTech, which is a training is intended to meet that professional development requirement. You could go through all of our ProTech products and get the full number of credits that you need for the 2-year cycle. But the way that this has been designed has been engineered around thinking that no longer do we have technicians who have all the time in 2 weeks or a month to go through the 40 hours and all the supplemental training before they get assigned a client, but they have shorter opportunities for professional development. They've got 30 minutes before the client arrives. They've got 30 minutes after their lunch break. They've got a little bit at the end of the day. How do you create some meaningful learning opportunities for technicians that expand on the skills that they do have, things that maybe they need to review, and then do that in a way that anchors it to supervision. Okay, so that's where ProTech comes in. These have been created in somewhat of a micro-learning format. They're highly interactive, scenario-based. We tried to use relevant scenarios that would apply to the broad swath of ABA clinics that we've seen in home settings and community settings and so forth. The way this product is set up is, I think, pretty cool. And I realize I'm saying that as someone who was involved with it, but it is pretty cool. So you've decided that you've got technicians coming in, they've gone through the 40 hours, and now they're working with one client, okay? And in 3 weeks, we've got some schedule changes, we've got some turnover, so that technician is now going to work with a different client who has different programming, and they have their different skill acquisition procedures that are being used that weren't being used with their first client. And that process continues and continues, and they gain a little bit more responsibility, and maybe they're sticking with it, so they want to stay around and they want to move up in the organization. And now you've gotten to a place where they're reliable. They're showing up to work, they're engaged with the learners, they care about the work, they're following through on all the requirements you have for the job, but their skills need some sharpening. They haven't revisited, prompting in a really long time, and we are going to try to embed some more advanced prompting strategies into some client programs, and they're not ready to do that. So then you would go through our prompting course. And it's got a series of review segments, and then it's got a series of new content, like going into maybe different kinds of response prompts that they haven't used or haven't used in a while. And so what the program does is break up each of those components, provide a lot of scenarios, both in video and in interactions, to give them opportunities to practice, how do I implement this prompting procedure? How does this prompting procedure look different if I'm working on this skill versus that skill? How does this apply to my client? And then we've also paired with each of these courses a supervisor workbook, so that you might say, I'm supervising these 5 clients and these 10 RBTs. And for the months of March and April, I want to focus on improving prompting and error correction skills with my team. How can I do that in a unified way, rather than looking at all the deficits that could be out there for all 10 of your technicians and saying you've got to triage every single one of them, okay? Which is something that is very common, is that you look, it's just too overwhelming. You really can't handle it, especially with the constraints around funding and so forth. So you say, we're going to focus on prompting and error correction. It may not be what everybody needs, but it's good enough for most people, okay? Everybody can do a little review of prompting and error correction. So we set up a program, a learning path that's going to be over March, we're going to focus on prompting. Twice a week, you're going to go through your little 20-minute dose of ABA Technologies ProTech. When we have our group supervision meeting, we're going to actually practice, and the handbook will walk you through that. We're going to do some role play on how to use these prompts. You're going to go out in the wild and find 2 programs that your client's working on and what prompts might be useful to them, or what prompts are written into the program, and we're going to practice those, okay? Then you get to talk about it at individual supervision. And then when you're going into practice and you're taking procedural fidelity data, your procedural fidelity data, it may not be the highest, okay? But you say, you know what? I'm going to focus on the theme of prompting and error correction, okay? We can't do it all. We're going to focus on a couple of things at one time. So in those instances, you can say, I know they've learned this. They've had this kind of priming exercise from the online course. We've talked about it in group supervision. We've done a little bit in individual supervision. Now, when I'm in vivo, I'm going to be focusing on this. This is where all of my feedback is going to go. Okay. Now that's very different from just offering a bunch of one-off CE events. And those do have value. They absolutely do have value. But often they have more value for people who are trained at the master's and PhD level because their learning histories are much broader in the area of behavior analysis. They've seen a lot more. They know a lot more about the profession. They know a lot more about the science and its applications. So when you're working with the technician level, their experiences are often much smaller. They've had fewer clients to work with. They've maybe just focused on implementing programs. They haven't seen what's happening behind the scenes, okay? So they don't have a lot of that background knowledge. And then you're going to see a lot of gaps. So that's where I'm cautious about this professional development requirement, because I think a lot of organizations are going to be like, let's pick a topic for March, let's pick another topic for April, and then over the 2 years, we'll meet all the requirements. That's like a no-go, okay? That's like a sometimes we'll do that, but we're probably not going to do that all the time, okay? Because we're going to be really dissatisfied with the results on the other end. So whether you use our ProTech or you use another program, it's so important to think about this overall experience. And if you want to work with us, we've got that covered. We've got the 3.0 that's going to start at the onboarding, move them into working on the job, and then we're going to get through ProTech. And then it comes to the other end, which is supervision, because all of that only really works if you've got people in the environment who can really support it. And so we have a new dynamic supervisor program. It's meets the 8-hour supervision course. You can see all those instructor names at the bottom, but we source some of the best talent in behavior analysis and supervision and organizational behavior management to put together this program. I think it really addresses a lot of different areas, a lot of gaps for BCBAs. And it's going to be an anchor for them being able to implement ProTech, them to be implementing the 3.0. I'm just going to go back to this one for a second because I know it's the truth and we all know it, which is that depending on what you do for your technician professional development, you better make sure that your BCBAs know the content. They know what technicians are being trained on, because so many times I've seen where training directors have said, we're going to have this great CE event. This was before CE was a thing for techs, but we're going to have this great event on prompting. And everybody's going to come and they're going to work on it and they're going to get to practice it. And they're so excited and everybody's energized. And then we go back and we realize that the BCBAs who are on the job don't know a whole lot about prompt hierarchies, don't know a whole lot about programming prompts and programs. That's a big problem, okay? So we've tested ProTech with BCBAs who needed to go through our ProTech to review the content themselves. So it's really important that those events are all going to sync up in some way, and know that you're not just going to make some assumptions about what your BCBAs know and don't know and can do, and that's all going to translate. And you got to have a plan to know that what happens in training, what happens in those professional development opportunities is in some way going to make its way over to the behavior intervention plan, the treatment plan, and so on and so forth. Okay. Again, thanks so much to Rose and Michael for providing us those two downloads that I think will be very helpful for you as you begin to think about compliance in your own organization. I'm also really excited that they will be starting, they're partnering with ABA Technologies to start ABA Compliance Podcast, which on the face of it doesn't really sound that interesting. But I can say that years ago, Rose and Michael did this fantastic compliance talk at a conference, and I was just so jazzed about it. I thought I was going to go into compliance full time. I decided not to do that, but they really know what they're talking about. And what I think is so great about what they're trying to do and what we're trying to do is to educate technicians, educate BCBAs, educate people in the organization, whether they're clinical or non-clinical, about what's expected of them and what they can do to ensure that they're not only compliant, but they're developing programs that are going to impact the individuals that they serve. And that's not just clients that you see. That is also the technicians that go through your programs. You should see them as a recipient of what you're developing. You should see them as a consumer of what you're developing as an organization. So, one more time, read those documents. You could start a little journal club at your organization. You could say, this month we're going to read the BACB newsletter and there's going to be a quiz, because all of us are responsible for knowing this, okay? Same thing with the training outlines, and that document with the training information is chock full of all the kinds of stuff that you need to know. Even if you say we're going to go buy this product off the shelf from maybe Technologies, they've got it covered, which we do, but you still need to know what's in there, because it's all going to come back to your organization. And you want to make sure that you know that, so that you can also answer questions of other people that are supervising the training. So thank you so much for being here. We've got some questions in the chat that I think we might answer. And I think a couple of people have asked about whether or not this content would be available afterwards. And we are going to be emailing the recording and the slides, so you have all of that. But again, got to go read these documents. Don't just take our slides, go read these documents, because our slides are summaries of what's in those documents. And there's much more detail that you're responsible for. So maybe some questions. I know there was a question at the top that I was looking at when Danielle was speaking. Okay, so there was a question about behavioral skills training, and whether or not the training, does this training mean that the trainings cannot be fully virtual? Okay, so if the company were to have in vivo training, but the 40-hour certificate is based on all virtual, what would BST look like? Great question. Okay, so I'm going to break virtual down into two categories. One is asynchronous virtual training. Okay, that's like going through a 40-hour training where there is no instructor. It's automated. It might be a combination of video-based instruction. It might be some text that they're reading. There's some knowledge checks that they're answering. At least in our 40-hour training, behavioral skills training is built into that. So for example, when we go and teach people the different conditions of an FA, they're going to see some video example. We're going to be doing some instruction around what's happening in that attention condition. What's the RBT's role? What's the BCBA's role? Then they're going to see a video model of that, of the technician maybe collecting data in that condition. They're going to be answering some questions around it in that related to that condition. So the BST components are embedded within a number of our exercises, not within everything, okay? Because there's a difference between doing concept instruction, for example, on what is reinforcement versus implementing reinforcement. But we do have behavioral skills training embedded within that training. The important thing is that what comes after the and, which are all those other types of training that can be packaged as part of meeting the requirements. I'm really glad the BACB specified different modalities of training, because there were many situations in 2.0 where people were going through full video lecture that was completely passive. There was not a lot of meaningful responding in it. So make sure that you are looking at what your training providers are providing and making sure that those BST components are part of anything that you're doing, especially in delivering procedures. You know, when you're teaching preference assessments, when you're teaching how to run discrete trials, that there are opportunities where they're going to see high quality models that are going to be relevant to the setting they're working in. They're going to see examples and non-examples of people implementing those discrete trials, and they're going to see complexity over the instruction. So they're not just going to see what a discrete trial looks like when it's super easy to implement, but they're going to see it when there are errors that occur, or when you need to use certain prompting strategies, or you're using a different reinforcement schedule. So you want to make sure kind of all of that's baked into what you're doing, and that can be one of the ways that you do your internal audit. You go in and look at those, you're looking for those various components before you select a provider.
There was a question here that's related to the points you're making, which was, does the 40-hour training, can it still be completed by an external provider? And I just want to provide some clarification here that yes, it absolutely can be. But the points that Adam is making right now is that it really, the onus or the burden of making sure those additional components are being completed and being tracked and documented, and you're meeting all those requirements, do fall on the company internally. So just to clarify, yes, the 40-hour training can be done by an online course or an external provider, what have you. But those other pieces, bits and pieces, still need to be planned for. They need to be systematic and they need to be documented carefully.
Yeah. And I think thanks for adding that clarification in there, because one of the things that I have mostly been talking about are organizations where they are taking on the responsibility of issuing the certificate, where it's one of their staff members who's the responsible trainer for that training. Unlike people who might come and take, for example, our RBT through Florida Institute of Technology, they take it, they get their 40-hour certificate, and then they go out and find a job. Okay. And I think many years ago, we saw more of that situation going on, which is people would come and get training from another provider and then go find an RBT job, where now RBT training is embedded right into the job. So great question. All right, Danielle, I don't know if there are others in here that you want to look at, and we can also send out some responses after the webinar ends.
I mean, there's some questions here. So what kind of content would be eligible for professional development CUs for RBTs? Is it the same as for BCBAs? Did the BACB specify this yet? So if we go back to that table, I don't know if you can back up to it, Adam. Thank you. The BACB has provided some kind of broad guidelines around this. It's not specifying content yet. I would imagine, and this is an assumption, don't quote me on this, that they will provide further guidance on this when they also provide further information about the kind of documentation that is required. What is similar to BCBAs is that now they have to complete those CUs or those professional, ongoing professional development requirements. There's going to have to be documentation of that can then be submitted and is potentially eligible for audit. So I'm sorry, that wasn't probably as specific as the attendee would have liked, but more to come on this from the BACB. They have not specified exactly what needs to be trained. It does have to be behavior analytic in nature, and it can fall into one of these three categories where maybe it's within the organization, such as an in-service training or a CE event provided by an ACE provider, or university classes given at an accredited university.
Great.
Can I just ask, has the BACB specified if you are an ACE provider for BCBA CEUs, will you also be an ACE provider for RBT CEUs, or is there a separate process?
I'm not aware that there's any specification on that. Adam, are you aware that this would be separate?
I believe that they're both the same. It's something that I have to go back and check the handbook for, but I did not see a distinction in what would be an ACE provider for BCBA and an ACE provider for RBT.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, like we said, we'll send out the recording and the slides from this presentation. I am putting in the chat, Danielle, putting our emails in here if you'd like to contact us, if you have questions about the changes, or if you want to talk to us about working with you on a training project, or working with us on getting our 3.0 embedded into your training systems. We're really happy to work with you on doing that. And thanks for being here.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you so
you,
much, everyone.
everyone.